Thank you so much for these remarks. It was really fascinating to hear your thoughts and how they've evolved over your life. I really appreciate that you've
Betsy Ross.
Betsy Ross onwards, and now there's no one feeding you the lines off stage. So we gathered some questions from our fellows and from our registrants, and we're very grateful that you've agreed to entertain them. And so I'm going to pose some of them for you. And first is having to do with the role of the media in our constitutional democracy. So various observers from across the political spectrum, right to left, have said that the greatest threat to national security is the U.S. domestic political situation. How do you view that as a remark, and what do you think the role of the news media is in exacerbating or alleviating those differences?
I think we have an obligation to present factual information. And I trust our viewers are very smart. They're very intelligent, and they can make their own decisions. I'm somebody who consumes media across every platform, every ideological conversation and viewpoint. I think it's important for us to have such a robust conversation about that. I would say, too, I think there have been many times over our country's history that it's felt like we are at a breaking point. Joel Rosenberg years ago wrote a book called Implosion, and it talks about all the different times that it felt like our country would not survive the latest test of our democracy, of our republic, of our Constitution. And he talks about the ways that we found our way back from the edge. And so I'm always optimistic and hopeful that we are going to have tough conversations, and we are going to be able to move toward our country sticking together with the safeguards that are there, with working to understand people who may not agree with us. So I think the media's role is to be very clear. Listen, if you're advocacy or entertainment or opinion, you need to clearly identify that. I'm in the news division. So for me, the show we do on Sundays is always important to me to have full representation from all viewpoints and to give them a chance to speak. Because I think when people have information, we're doing our jobs and they can decide what to do with it.
And so when you think about this relationship between news and entertainment and the necessity of any corporation to have a bottom line, what are the tensions that you experience? What responsibility do journalists have to, say, avoid sensational vocabulary or make sure that certain facts are stipulated in a story? Has this changed over the years you've been in the business? And does cable news specifically have a set of challenges that is unlike in other media?
I do think we're at this moment again where things feel very polarized and very divided. And polling shows us that there are extremes on the left and the right, but that most of America is in the middle. And I think about your neighborhood where you live or the building that you live in. If you had a neighbor in trouble, you're not going to stop and ask them who they voted for. I still think Americans, by and large, are going to jump in and help each other. So I think that we can make too much of the loudest voices on the extremes. And so we have to have a responsibility in the way that we host those voices and have those debates. I've had people who have gotten so upset they've threatened to walk off. I've had a couple walk off the set, which is always fun on live television when you lose a guest. It's challenging, but I think for the most part, my goal is to host a conversation where people are informed more than they are entertained. I do think you can be entertaining as well. I mean, we include some things on the show that are a little bit non-traditional, but I think that we need to serve people with what they come to us for, which is information. I do think cable news kind of gets a bad rap because we are on 24 hours a day. We got a lot of hours to fill, and you will hear some work stream voices on the left and the right. But again, we each have opinion divisions, news divisions, and I think when you tune in, maybe you are looking for that opinion person who lines up with you, and that's what you want to hear that night. But if you're looking for good news, meaning just straight down the middle and giving you all voices, I think there are places still to find that.
And if we were to turn the conversation for a moment more towards the state of United States institutions and political parties, you have been in conservative circles during what has been a very interesting time in the history of the Republican Party. And it is a party that, of course, ran on small government and opposition to the administrative state on behalf of individual freedom and states' rights. But its leaders have now sent the federal government to override state and local law enforcement. What accounts for this pivot in your mind?
I think that the parties are both very much about making their tents as big as possible. And so I think that means that the old guard and the certain principles, the establishment sort of principles that Democrats had, that Republicans had, they're very much being challenged by these new populist ideas. And so while I would have interviewed a senator 20 years ago who would have said, we got to balance the budget on the Republican side, now they are more willing to have a conversation about, well, if we maneuver this here and there and use this math, we can get this done for more people in this way. And I think for Democrats, part of the conversation they're having is their old guard was much more, say, deferential to Israel and to the decisions that Israel makes as an entity. Now you're seeing a more progressive voice within the party saying maybe we should question some of that. There's a split there. So I think that these parties are trying to find their way, but I do think they're becoming more populist in the sense that they're more willing to entertain ideas that the old guard wouldn't have. And just last week, we had a conversation on the show about this issue of bringing in federal entities into states and localities that have not asked for them and where they are not welcome. And, posing this question to Republican lawmakers about, right, you ran on, states' rights and smaller government and all of those things. What does this mean now? So I think that both parties will tell you, well, just like with the Constitution, things change over time, and we're going to be applying our principles to a different set of facts and hoping to grow their individual party tents in the process.
I noticed in your remarks you naturally dedicated a great deal of attention to the role of the judiciary and of the courts. In this current presidential term, we've been living through, of course, many executive actions, as we have in previous presidential terms, as well as the rise of numerous emergency injunctions, and, of course, the debate over the validity of those injunctions in different contexts. What's clear is that in whether you're talking about the executive action or the emergency injunctions, that power is shifting away from Congress, away from the House of the people, as it were. So do you see a danger in courts becoming the main arena for political disputes that Congress cannot resolve? Many people fear a coming constitutional crisis, or go so far as to say we are already in one. What, in your view, would constitute a constitutional crisis, and how do you rate the risk of one?
I think the fact that all of these branches and all these checks are holding is a good sign for people. You don't want the courts to be overwhelmed, and I think the Supreme Court is very full. Its docket is very full, and this idea of getting things done on an emergency basis, people will say, well, they're not having full briefings and arguments. That emergency docket has always existed, but it is very busy. And I think it's fair to say that President Trump had 4 years to think about what he was going to do between terms, and very much came into office with a long list of what he was going to do. And in talking with people within the administration, I don't think it's a secret. They knew a lot of these would immediately end up in the courts and would be challenged through the legal system, and they were willing to issue them in order to test those boundaries. So I think that's always been sort of the plan for this administration. I do think the courts are handling a lot of things because Congress can't get much done. They have the worst rating of anyone in Washington and in the country. I think that they're at like 18, 19%. People don't really love Congress, and the complete standstill that it seems to be at. There are very few bipartisan things that they agree on. They're getting ready to have another fight over what could be a government shutdown in the next few weeks. So get ready for the next round of that. You've heard all the arguments before. I myself, like I said, I'm an optimistic person. I reference back to Joel Rosenberg's book on implosion, knowing that our country has felt almost irreparably torn apart and in a quote unquote constitutional crisis at times, but that we have had the framework to draw us back from that edge. And so I remain optimistic that we're going to get there.
If you had the power to do one thing to promote, encourage, or foster education in civics, what would you do? And what is the basic error committed by the government or the opposition in encouraging good civic habits?
Well, I love what you all are doing here, having these conversations and having this place to talk about what, at fundamentally the core of this country, what it is, what it means, how it should evolve. I think that where the mistake is made sometimes is where people are unwilling to have difficult conversations. I've got a couple friends who are professors at Princeton, Robbie George and Cornell West. If you know anything about the two of them, they could not be more different. When you think about their ideology, their political beliefs, how they view the world, they are the best of friends. And they regularly have these really uncomfortable debates and walk away and still love each other and hug and do things together regularly. And I think one of the most important things that Professor George ever said to me was, you have to walk into every debate or conversation with something that may be uncomfortable or heated or difficult, at least with the possibility that you're wrong. That you have to have enough of an open mind to say, like, I might be the person who is wrong here, and not think about ending that conversation with somebody being right, somebody being wrong, but at least the possibility that you're hearing ideas that you may not agree with. It helps you to better frame your own arguments or to learn something new and change your position. So I think we need to have more uncomfortable debates, and I think that's be part of civics education.
And a lot of time, understandably, on the First Amendment in your remarks. What do you think is the most important provision of the Constitution?
That's tricky. That's like choosing your favorite child, very Sophie's choice. With that, it feels like obviously the First Amendment is such an underpinning to everything else. The ability to go out there and to say what you think without winding up in jail, I think, is a beautiful part of American society. I've covered so many of these cases at the Supreme Court. I think about Westboro Baptist, which, if you know anything about them, they show up and protest at funerals. Regularly, the signs and things that they use, we can't even put them on air. They're too offensive and would be a shock to the conscience. But the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in their favor to be able to do it. And so I think the First Amendment, and knowing how powerful it is in protecting the most, what many people would think is despicable, unpalatable speech, the whole purpose of it. So it feels like the First Amendment really is the key to being able to exercise the rest of the amendments as well.
You've demonstrated remarkable optimism. I think it's admirable and a good example for us all. But not all share the optimism that you've expressed. And recently there was a podcast that was making the rounds that had a rather ominous message to the effect of that, given the last 6 months we've all lived through, we should not be surprised if we wind up in an authoritarian dictatorship, because this is playbook that would have been followed. Are you optimistic about the future of democracy? And what would you say to those who are experiencing such apocalyptic thoughts?
I think it's important to acknowledge how people are feeling, because people do have real distress. I mean, I meet people all the time that are unsettled, in their own personal lives, and they are worried, and I think it's important to acknowledge where people are at and that they feel discomfort. I still go back to the fact that I think our country has been stretched much further than it is now. I think there have been challenges all along the way, and the fact that we continue to rebound, I have great faith in that. But I acknowledge that there are tensions, maybe because I've covered Washington for so long and the political world for so long. I've heard people say that 20, 30 years ago. People were also worried and concerned. And so for me, especially in the months after a presidential election, there is a lot of raw emotion and passion. And I think it's good to give each other some space to express whatever those concerns are and those thoughts and emotions are, and to listen to them and to find out if there are ways you can sit down and hammer through some of those concerns. How do we support each other to work together in ways that we can, without compromising principles, and be able to get to some type of solution. But listen, the 6-8 months after a new president is sworn in, it happened the 4 years before and the 4 years before that. There are always great fears, I think, about what's ahead for any particular administration.
Well, I want to thank you for your availability and willingness to participate in today's event. So I thank you for your remarks and for meeting with our students. I know that they enjoyed it immensely. I hope you'll stay and that you will all stick around and enjoy some refreshments and talk with one another and introduce yourselves to all of our speakers and to congratulate them on their great job. But thank you, Shannon, for being here, and thank you to all of our speakers for a great event.
Thank you.